Hello. Hello everyone, thanks for tuning in. Just saying a few hellos to the people on the YouTube chat. Carol tuned in. Oh, hi, I'm Mac from Glasgow in Scotland. Helen from Norwich. Hello from Glasgow. Rosalind Bird from Edinburgh. Lucy from Norwich. Heather from London. Tyann from Luxembourg. Megan from South Wales. Oh, I've got the sound coming out of my iPad. Caboose from Great Yarmouth. James Epps. Anne Follows from Suffolk. Rosie. Liam Staton in Norwich. Legia from Great Yarmouth. Marianne Holly. Jack saying, come on, Sarah. Thanks for tuning in. Oh, we're not in a tech hole, we're just waiting for some more people to join. Caroline Fisher saying hello from rainy North Norfolk and hello from Norfolk Coast. So we've got quite a range there. Just good to check the sound is coming through. Looks all good. Thank you for joining us tonight, everyone. Just gonna check on my... Yeah, all sounds good. Great. So tonight is the 8th part of the Assembly Online programme. And the talk is Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, Derek Jarman and Prospect Cottage, Dungeness, Kent, 1987 to 1994, by Sarah Lowndes. And we'll be showing photographs by Sarah Lowndes and Howard throughout. I thought I should give a short introduction to Sarah. She does quite a lot of different things. Sarah is a writer, curator and lecturer, and she's a research fellow at Norwich University of the Arts, and she contributes to the Sainsbury Centre Public Programme and also works in the Time and Tide Museum in Great Yarmouth in the education team. Sarah established Kunsthal Chroma in 2017 to enhance the cultural provisions available in Chroma, and has since hosted visual arts, music, poetry, oh, maybe not poetry, cinema and performance events. She's recently been co-editing a publication with Nell Croose at Sainsbury Centre called Sight Writing, that's working with local writers to create an alternate catalogue for the Sainsbury Centre collection. And lastly, thing to mention is the publication of Fieldwork, New Nature Writing from East Anglia, which is an anthology with writing from 40 local authors selected from submissions. A lot going on, always, a lot of really good work. But I thought it was good to give a wider picture of her. She's mainly reading from just a book. So without further ado, I'm going to try and smoothly pass over to Sarah, who should appear as well, and then start the presentation.
Hello.
And oh, just open up the slideshow. Present. Okay, I think that's just get rid of the quick chat. Sorry, it jumped. I'm just checking it's come through on the stream okay. Can you just try talking?
Yeah, so hello everybody. It's really lovely to be here with you all. And thank you very much to Henry Jackson Newcomb for the invitation to speak tonight, and also to Assembly House. Thank you also to Howard Sooley for permission to use his beautiful photographs of Derek Jarman and his garden that I'm going to use in this talk tonight. So, as Henry's already explained, this talk will focus upon the life and work of English filmmaker, painter, diarist, queer rights campaigner, and radical gardener Derek Jarman, and is based on a chapter from my book, Contemporary Artists Working Outside the City, Creative Retreat, which came out in 2018. Tonight, I'm mostly going to talk about three things, beginning with P: plants, poetry, and pride. Over the last year or two, there's been renewed critical interest in Derek Jarman, which doesn't surprise me at all. His life and work continue to provide inspiration for so many, and it's for that reason it's been very heartening to see new Derek Jarman exhibitions and books, and in particular, the successful campaign led this year by Art Fund to secure the future of Prospect Cottage. My talk tonight has a particular focus on the years that followed 1987, when Derek Jarman bought a fisherman's cottage in Dungeness, Kent, and began dividing his time between that locale and his flat in Charing Cross Road in London. 1986 saw many significant events in Jarman's life, including being diagnosed with the HIV virus and falling in love with Keith Collins, whom he met that year and with whom he lived until his death. Growing critical and popular acclaim has moved to Prospect Cottage and the building of his famous garden there. He wrote, "The moment the engines failed, becalmed, I started rowing for my life." In the shadow of Dungeness nuclear power station, Jarman constructed an extraordinary garden, which he recorded both in his 1990 film The Garden and in his books Modern Nature, At Your Own Risk, Chroma, Derek Jarman's Garden, and Smiling in Slow Motion, which not only documented the growth of the garden, but also of his love for Keith Collins, who he referred to by the pet name HB. The title of this talk, Vaster Than Empires and More Slow, is derived from Renaissance poet Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, in which he writes that my vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. This vision of growth is then truncated by the pressure of mortality, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. Marvell's poetry encapsulates this accelerated personal growth and the raising of Jarman's garden that took place in the warm climate of Dungeness and amidst his late love affair with Keith Collins. Derek Jarman's identity as a queer man shaped his entire artistic output. Probably the most important quality of art for him was to be found in what he called the attrition between private and public worlds. From his early films onwards, Jarman sought to depict queer sexuality, hitherto absent from both cinema and television, in a positive light. He explained, "My films are a message of solidarity to those who have been dispossessed, because when I made Sebastian in 1975, there was no way of imagining yourself as gay. You wouldn't even see gays on television, so how could you come to terms with yourself?" Jarman's writings were also a key aspect of his creative practice, and from the early 80s onwards, he was an articulate defender of gay rights, publishing his autobiography, Dancing Ledge, in 1984, just as the gay liberation of the late 60s and 70s was coming under attack. After Jarman's HIV-positive diagnosis in 1986, he became a noted activist, campaigning not only for gay rights, but also advocating for greater openness and awareness of HIV and AIDS. In his book, At Your Own Risk, A Saint's Testament, Jarman wrote that, "For the first 25 years of my life, I lived as a criminal, and for the next 25 were spent as a second-class citizen, deprived of equality and human rights. No right to adopt children, and if I had children, I could be declared an unfit parent, illegal in the military, an age of consent of 21, no right of inheritance, no right of access to a loved one, no right to public affection, no right to an unbiased education, no legal sanction of my relationships, and no right to marry. These restrictions subtly deprive me of my freedom." The three phases of Derek Jarman's career correspond roughly with the first three phases of gay liberation. the pre-liberation era of the 1960s, the post-liberation era of the 1970s, and lastly, the period of AIDS from 1980 onwards. The first phase of Derek Jarman's creative life began in 1968, when he started his career as a painter in London, exhibiting at the Lisson Gallery and designing sets and costumes for theatre productions in the capital in the late 1960s, before a commission by the filmmaker Ken Russell to act as a production designer on his films The Devils and Savage Messiah brought Jarman into the second significant phase of his career, the world of filmmaking, which became his main occupation. Jarman realised his own first films using Super 8 before making his first feature films, Sebastian, Jubilee and The Tempest. In 1986, Jarman completed his long-awaited Life of the Painter Caravaggio, which had taken 7 years to realise due to funding delays. After the film was complete, he took the test for HIV, which, as he had expected, was positive. The third and final phase of Jarman's career began with his decision to go public with his HIV-positive diagnosis in 1986, a brave and defining act at a time when scaremongering about HIV and AIDS was at its height. Jarman had long protested against the prejudicial treatment of gays in the media and by the government, and now he used his HIV diagnosis as a means of challenging publicly the stigma of HIV and AIDS. However, Jarman brushed off any praise, saying, "In any case, I had no choice. I've always hated secrets, the canker that destroys." Between 1987 and 1994, the last phase of Jarman's creative life unfolded, heightened by a sense of living in borrowed time. With Prospect Cottage as a restorative escape from the pressures of the London art scene and the support of Collins and other friends, Jarman experienced increased creative freedom and became highly productive, making 6 full-length films in the last 7 years of his life. Jarman spoke of his cottage and garden as offering an experience of solitude and stillness that fed his creativity, and as his own kingdom, a kind of sequestered utopian realm that he referred to as the end of the globe, the 5th quarter of the world. Derek Jarman's life in Dungeness began on a spring afternoon in 1987, while out scouting in Kent with his partner Keith Collins and his close collaborator, the actor Tilda Swinton, seeking a bluebell wood for a scene in the film that would become The Garden. The trio drove through Dungeness, where Jarman had previously filmed images for The Last of England. Keith Collins recalled, "Charmed by the landscape, we decided to visit the old lighthouse. Derek said, 'There's a beautiful fisherman's cottage here, and ever it was for sale, I think I'd buy it.' As we neared the cottage, black varnished with bright yellow window frames, we saw the green and white for sale sign. The improbability of it made the purchase inescapable." Prospect Cottage was perched in the midst of one of the world's largest shingle formations and in the shadow of the nearby nuclear power station. Although Jarman aligned himself with green politics, he was also fascinated by apocalyptic scenes and took delight in the relationship of the tiny, characterful cottage to the glowing nuclear power station, which put him in mind of his favourite film, The Wizard of Oz, in which a small Kansas homestead is displaced by a twister and lands up near the Emerald City. Jarman had inherited enough money to make it possible for him to buy Prospect Cottage in May 1987. He remembered, "I bought the freehold and a little extra land for £750, a price I still think is a bargain." The relative isolation of the cottage was very much an attraction, especially as Jarman's fame grew and his health worsened. In London, he lamented the increasing attention of journalists and admirers who subjected him to a barrage of questions, which made his head spin like a child's top. And his flat in Charing Cross Road offered no respite, as there another enormous pile of letters blocked the door. Would I write, judge, give advice, attend, approve, help? The phone rings and I found myself running. He wrote that the cottage offered him an escape from traps of notoriety and expectation, of collaboration and commerce, of fame and fortune. Jarman's childhood homes had all been enclosed, RAF bases and boarding schools. He recollected that he always felt trapped during childhood. Stuck in a boarding school, stuck in RAF camps surrounded by barbed wire, I was conditioned to expect it. My dad would say, "Are you going to town? Are you going to the village?" So the same thing reproduced itself in the school. Could you get out and exit? No, perhaps not. I was conditioned to actually expect it by that time. In contrast, one of the aspects of Prospect Cottage that most delighted him was the unrestricted views all round the cottage. The horizon was endless, broken occasionally by telegraph poles pushing up from the verge, only to be dwarfed by the magnitude of the sky above. In January 1989, Jarman wrote, "There are no walls or fences. My garden's boundaries are the horizon. In this desolate landscape, the silence is only broken by the wind and the gulls squabbling around the fishermen bringing in the afternoon catch." Jarman remembered the starkness of the surrounding landscape was also part of the appeal of the location. "When I came to Dungeness in the mid-80s, I had no thought of building a garden. It looked impossible. Shingle with no soil supported a sparse vegetation." Before long, however, Jarman began bringing home flints from the nearby beach and arranging them in the shingle. The bed looked great, like dragon's teeth. My journey to the sea each morning had a purpose. The next step was planting a dog rose, and then I found a curious piece of driftwood and used this, and one of the necklaces of holy stones that I hung on the wall to stake the rose. The garden had begun. Gradually, Jarman began to create a unique garden in the land surrounding the cottage, with assistance from Keith Collins. Collins remembered, "The garden started accidentally. A sea-worn driftwood staff topped with a knuckle of beachcombed bone was used to stake a transplanted dog rose, and an elongated low-tide flint protected a seedling sea kale from careless feet. Over the coming years, more beachcomb treasures were added." Jarman wrote often in his diaries about the calming qualities of working in his garden of sculptures and ragged flowers. "I saw it as a therapy and a pharmacopoeia. Twilight here is like no other. It lingers in a perfect calm. You feel as you stand here that tired time is having a snooze." The contemplative activity of gradually creating a garden in the shingle proved energizing for Jarman, even as increasing ill health caused by HIV came to dominate the last years of his life. Dungeness receives more sunlight, less rainfall, and a shorter winter frost than any other place in Britain, and so it was very much a place suited to a sun worshipper like Jarman. Prospect Cottage was a place where Jarman daily observed the sun. He wrote, "From my home, I can see the sun clamber out of a misty sea. It wakes me through the bedroom window and then stays with me all day. There are no trees or hills to hide it. When it sets over the flatlands in the west, I sit and watch it on a throne-like chair that I rescued from a rubbish dump. I never miss the setting sun, however cold the weather." In his garden at Dungeness, Jarman constructed a number of stone circles made with flints and pebbles from the seashore. He wrote, "The stones, especially the circles, remind me of dolmens, standing stones. They have the same mysterious power to attract." He wrote of his seashore finds, which he painstakingly carried back to the cottage in a plumber's bag. "I invest my stones with the power of those at Avebury. I have read all the mystical books about ley lines and circles. I built the circles with this behind my mind." The presence of the sun animated Jarman's garden, and to harness it, he constructed 2 small sundials and a circle of gourds with a central dolmen that revealed the dark shadows cast by the bright sun. The name of Jarman's boat hole, Prospect Cottage, was a very suitable name, given that Jarman was very much a prospector, searching in his shingle garden for reconciliation to his grief over losing many friends to HIV and relieving his own fear of impending death from the same virus by seeking treasures on the shoreline, seedlings to nurture, driftwood to turn into sculptures, and experiences of sunrises, sunsets, and wild weather. He wrote in April 1989, "This evening, the silence in the gorse grove was truly golden. It's a beautiful thought that Pliny says gorse was used to catch the specks of gold from the gravel that prospectors panned. Indeed, the gorse circle that Jarman planted and tended in his garden at Dungeness had a stone dolmen in its centre, replicating in three-dimensional form the alchemist's symbol for gold, a circle with a dot in the middle. The golden gorse circle that Jarman created in his garden also symbolised many of the concepts of Renaissance poetry which he loved, in particular the idea of eternal love that transcends death. In the pages of At Your Own Risk, Jarman referenced the John Donne poem Sonnet 10, which is also often known by its first line, Death be not proud, in which physical death is reconfigured as a short sleep, after which we wake eternally. John Donne's wife had died 14 years before him, in 1617, which imbued his subsequent verse with a keen awareness of mortality. Indeed, T.S. Eliot, in Whispers of Immortality, said of Donne, he knew the anguish of the marrow, the ache of the skeleton. The John Donne poems Song and the Valediction Forbidding Morning describe lovers who are physically separated by death, but still remain spiritually close through dreams and memories. In Song, he writes, but think that we are but turned aside to sleep, they who one another keep alive, never parted be. And in A Valediction Forbidding Morning, Donne literally expanded on the same theme in a beautiful conceit which imagines the two lovers as the two arms of a compass who may travel far apart, but are always joined at their centre in their hearts. Thy firmness makes my circle just and makes me end where I begun. In the front garden, outside the front door, Jarman used stones collected from the beach to construct two small circles of 12 stones, each form a primitive sundial. Perhaps these two stone circles also represented two soulmates, separated physically, but marking time endlessly as the sun moves across the sky above. Derek Jarman's cottage and garden were an attempt to more fully experience the time he had remaining to him. The sun rising was bittersweet to him, signalling the relentless passage of time. After learning of the HIV-related death of the filmmaker Howard Brookner, a friend and former lover, he writes, how can anything endure the terrible rising of the sun, the death of 1,000 summers? He asks his departed friend, did you imagine one day the sun would not rise, that I would be left to bear witness to our friendship? In 1993, writing about the death of Brookner, Jarman recalls the wild night of fucking you on the floor of heaven, a reference both to London's famous first gay club, located underneath Charing Cross railway station, but also to the firmament of star-crossed lovers illuminating the night. Like Jarman's daily ritual of watching the sunset, watching the night sky during his time of mourning gave him an opportunity to experience a sense of a wider scheme of existence that was more ancient and expansive. Observing constellations in the night sky has a metaphorical significance in that it provides a means of locating ourselves within a wider reference frame of space and time. As T.S. Eliot puts it in Burnt Norton, earthbound behaviour can be reconciled amongst the stars. The cartographic theorist John Pickles writes that when we observe and point at a star, the pointing finger is literally indexical. It delimits from the field a point, a place, an object for our attention. It stabilizes a particular meaning from a world of possible meanings. Jarman envisaged his lost friends as in another place, a heaven that lay beyond death. As the shadows closed in, the stars came out. In May 1993, Jarman, whose health was now failing rapidly, had the first stanza and final 6 lines of John Donne's metaphysical poem, The Sun Rising, installed on the southern wall of Prospect Cottage. The text, written in Jarman's distinctive cursive script, had been made into a sculptural object by Jarman's friend, Peter Fillingham, using a laser cutter. First, Jarman had made the poem his own by editing it in a particular way. There were several notable effects of Jarman's edit of Donne. He removed the female pronoun she as all states and all princes I, turning this into a love poem that mentions only men, schoolboys, sour apprentices, court huntsmen, and the king. He also simplified the overall theme of the poem, excising mention of Indias of spice, wealth, and fraud, thus streamlining Donne's hyperbolic conceits, a hallmark of the poet known for his peculiar blend of passion and thought. Jarman's take on Donne concentrates on the sensual and natural aspects of the poem, excising some of Donne's brilliant metaphysical wit. Perhaps most significantly, what Jarman's edit did was to emphasize how the act of love could engender a different conception of time, in which the bedroom becomes a centre, a sphere where it is beyond both time and weather, no season knows nor clime, and which transcends hours, days, months, which are the rags of time. Existence telescopes into one room, the bedroom, in that the world's contracted thus, in which the bed itself is reimagined as the sun. This bed thy centre is, these walls thy sphere. The image of the bedroom as the centre of known existence reappears in another, later poem of Donne's, The Good Morrow, in which he writes that love makes one little room. Jarman said that the live experience of the natural world engrossed him in a way that he had never experienced before. He said, the sun comes up at the front of the house and it goes down at the back. I see the you could imagine. I see the sea, pink and brown, aquamarine, black, and I sit and watch this. I was very unaware of this. I had been in London for 30 years, and somehow you have to sit there and watch this to realize it was happening. In perhaps the most symbolic action of his years at Dungeness on the 22nd of September 1991, Derek Jarman was canonized as a saint by the Gay Order of Nuns, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, at his garden in Dungeness, Kent, crowned with a saint's halo appropriately woven of celluloid film. He wrote, I dithered about my costume like any old queen off to a ball. Should I be plain ordinary Joe Saint or something a little more glittering? I gave in to temptation and chose the sparkling golden robe that Stephen had worn as Edward II in the film. Howard Sooley took a photograph of Jarman in his ceremonial robes, seated in a wooden throne that Jarman had scavenged and then garlanded with necklaces made from cork floats washed up on the beach. The image of Jarman in his handmade throne, anointed saint by his alternative family, encapsulates the idea of creative refuge as a site of self-actualization. Sequestered in Dungeness, Jarman's status as an HIV-positive gay man became re-envisaged as a source of pride. Gardening gave Jarman an experience of flow, complete immersion in a task. He wrote, the gardener digs in another time, without past or future, beginning or end. A time that does not cleave the day with rush hours, lunch breaks, the last bus home. As you walk in the garden, you pass into this time. The moment of entering can never be remembered. Around you, the landscape lies transfigured. Here is the Amen beyond prayer. Jarman saw his garden in some ways as a magical space, like the Shakespearean forest, where time can be forgotten. As in the third act of As You Like It, when Orlando meets a disguised Rosalind in Arden Forest and he tells her, there is no clock in the forest. However, at the same time, Jarman's garden also constantly reminded him of time passing, as the seasons changed and he planted and nurtured very specific plants, some of which had been used for centuries to tell the time, as described by Renaissance poet Andrew Marvell in his poem, The Garden, which describes an elementary flower clock. Jarman wrote in Modern Nature that it's 12. My noon flower closes shop, Jack go to bed at noon, it shutteth itself at 12 of the clock, and showeth not his mouth open until the next day's sun doth make it flower anew. Jarman viewed his plants as always watchful, mindful of the movement of the sun in the heavens above. He wrote, "Under this blue sky, my clock-faced flower beds reflect the orb of the sun. They guard its rising and mark its setting. In the western land, they never sleep." In Derek Jarman's gardens, plants were not only physical living things, but also possessed a symbolic force, a means of accessing memories and guarding against forgetting. He wrote that my garden is a memorial, each circular bed and dial a true lover's knot planted with lavender, helichrysum, and santolina. Santolina, under the dominion of Mercury, resteth poison, putrefaction, and heals the bites of venomous beasts. While a sprig of lavender held in the hand or placed under the pillow enables you to see ghosts travel to the land of the dead. Jarman also grew rosemary in his Dungeness garden, quoting Thomas Moore, who loved it because it is the herb sacred to remembrance and therefore to friendship, whence a sprig of it has a dumb language. Jarman also quoted Shakespeare's Ophelia, "Here's rosemary for remembrance." Jarman pored over the writings of herbalists such as Culpepper and grew plants reputed to give strength. A sky blue borage plant in flower, one of a clump that self-seeded by the back door. It droops in the early morning frost, but recovers quickly. I, borage, bring courage. Jarman began trying to grow roses in his garden in January 1989. He bought a selection of old roses from Rassel's in Earl's Court, where he noted that the cashier had laughed at the idea of my wilderness garden. He recorded, "At 12, a load of manure arrived from the local stables. As I shoveled it, I realised how unfit I was. I had great difficulty keeping up with a cheerful Glaswegian farmer who must have been in his mid-60s. Without a wheelbarrow, I had to pull heavy sacks all day to transport even a third of the load around the garden." Fellow gardener Christopher Lloyd was impressed when he first visited Jarman's garden by how much effort he went to overcome the odds and nourish roses and other introduced plants in his garden. Writing, "Jarman did not leave matters to chance when seeking to establish new plants. To make a planting hole, the shingle had to be excavated and half of it would also roll back, so it was an effortful job. Then he put in well-rotted manure from the farm up the road, and the stones were returned at the end of the operation." For Jarman, such endeavours also served a practical role. He told an interviewer that keeping busy was the way to stay ahead of his illness. He explained, "At the moment it hasn't caught up with me because I've buried myself in work as a way of coping with my situation. I've been working on the house and garden here. I've watched people with a terminal illness coping. My mother, for instance, who had cancer." One of the roses that Jarman took such trouble to plant in his garden, Rosa Mundi, was a rose that had been on a journey. Jarman wrote that it had been brought back by a 12th century crusader and immortalized by Guillaume Dolores in his poem, The Roman La Rose. Jarman's project of linking literature and landscape through his planting scheme had a long and enchanting history. As the American land artist Robert Smithson pointed out, actually poets in a sense formulated the entire landscape view back in the 18th century. It wasn't architects and gardeners who invented the landscape, it was poets and essayists. By way of evidence, Smithson cites what he calls the greatest poem of the 20th century, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, which he describes as basically about the landscape, and Burnt Norton, the first section of Eliot's 4 quartets, which he describes as a lament for a neglected formal garden. In the opening lines of Burnt Norton, Eliot charts correspondences between nature and language. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. One of the most striking images in Burnt Norton is the symbol of the rose as a symbol of life and possibility, as contrasted with the yew tree as a recurrent symbol of death. At another point in the poem, Eliot uses the analogy of the rose garden as presenting a Frostian road not taken. He describes how footfalls echo in the memory down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. Of course, the idea of the rose as a symbol for fleeting youth had first appeared in far older sources. Since biblical times, the rose had been used as a metaphor for mortality, as it is a flower which flowers in early morning and fades in the evening of our age. Jarman naturally understood these resonances all too well and had been using roses as a symbol in his work for years, dating back to Bankside, when he'd paid £10 for a bouquet of roses that he then set on fire on the set of The Art of Mirrors in 1973. But at Dungeness, his strenuous physical efforts to grow roses showed that he, like Smithson, was committed to creating poetry through physical contact with the external world, reimagining roses as plants that could survive even in the wasteland.
Sarah, I was just going to say briefly, sorry to interrupt, so someone's pointed out on the YouTube chat as well, but just if you could turn the pages away from the microphone because it's crunchy loud.
Okay.
For the rest of it, everything else is really clear. Thank you. I'll mute myself again. Cheers.
Where was I? In 1987, the Conservative government dealt a serious blow to the gay community by introducing the Local Government Act with its infamous Clause 28, which prohibited state schools from promoting homosexuality. In other words, from teaching students that it is acceptable or normal. Jarman wrote, "The government is introducing the most serious legal attack on our rights since male homosexuality was outlawed more than 100 years ago. It gives succor to every bigot and tin pot dictator in the country who wants to go queer bashing." Jarman continued to travel back to London throughout the late 1980s and early 90s to lend his presence to demonstrations against Clause 28, writing that he was heartened to report that 4 times in 1988 we broke the record for Europe's largest queer demo: 12,000, 15,000, 20,000, 25,000. Despite the protests, the controversial clause came into effect in 1988, inspiring the formation of British gay rights advocacy group Stonewall in 1989 and Outrage in 1990. Some of their tactics involved public exposure or outing of homosexuals and lesbians in politics and the media, which guaranteed high levels of public interest. On the 24th of June 1989, Jarman reported that 20,000 gay men and lesbians had marched from Hyde Park to Kennington. He wrote, "Nothing can compare with the elation as the street becomes ours for a few short hours. The whistleblowing, cheering and waving songs. And each year, in spite of Margaret Thatcher's delinquent government, they are happier and more relaxed. Nothing shall turn the tide back now." Clause 28 is a clarion call to unity and has given us new purpose. The numbers and confidence of the marchers demonstrated the huge shift in confidence that had occurred since the first London Pride in 1972, when just 700 gay people had dared to march through the streets. And now more public protests were on their way as public demonstrations against Thatcher's poll tax built into riots by 1989, leading to the resignation of the Iron Lady in 1990. In 1989, Derek Jarman shot the experimental Super 8 film The Garden on location at his home in Dungeness, which was partly an experiment to see how it would work bringing the crew and actors to him, as opposed to shooting in a film studio. However, the shoot was fraught with difficulties and he became seriously ill during the making of this film, partly as a result of the stress of having his refuge besieged by his colleagues. The Garden was funded by the British Film Institute, although there was a mismatch between Jarman's desire to work in an improvisatory style and the funders' need to see a finished script, and this was also a further source of anxiety. The central theme of the film was a retelling of Christ's Passion, with the filmmaker positioned at points in the kaleidoscopic narrative as both the director of the action as a tortured Christ-like figure. The film was perhaps the first time that Jarman's Desert Garden had been revealed to an audience beyond his immediate inner circle, and audiences were beguiled by the beautiful images of waving grasses, rolling waves, and Tilda Swinton as an angel stroke Madonna wandering on the shingle shore at Dungeness, even as they were shocked by some other scenes of violence and brutality. Jarman's next film was an adaptation of Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, made when he was aged 49. This was Jarman's most politically outspoken work, which included footage of the outrage campaign, which Jarman had been closely involved in since the grassroots activist group had formed in London in May 1990. Outrage had been set up in response to two interlinked issues: escalating queer-bashing violence, including a wave of homophobic murders, in particular the kicking to death of Michael Booth in West London. Second, the huge rise in the number of gay and bisexual men arrested and convicted for consenting, victimless behaviour. The set of Edward II was also where Jarman met Howard Sooley, the filmmaker, photographer and gardener who had become a vital friend and supporter until his death. Sooley recalls, "I'd been sent on a magazine commission to do a portrait of him on the last day of filming of Edward II. And when I got to the studio, he wasn't well. He'd been ill and was kind of exhausted, and it was a kind of rebellious last day of school thing going on. I think they'd been picketing. Cliff Richard had been in one of the next door studios doing a pop video, and they'd been demonstrating to out Cliff Richard. So he just said, why don't you come to Dungeness and do the portrait there, as I don't really feel up to it now. So I said, that would be nice, and I did that, and then we became friends." Howard Sooley became, along with Keith Collins and Peter Fillingham, one of Jarman's key collaborators as the garden at Prospect Cottage developed between 1990 and 1994. In the 3 years that followed, Sooley remembered, "We did a lot of gardening. We just seemed to go to nurseries and have adventures, and that was great. There were lots of elements to the garden, but I think the collaboration was one of those elements. The garden became a way of attracting people to what he was doing, but also a way of sharing the space at Dungeness. Derek was a great collaborator. He was kind of always happy in collaboration." I remember him saying once, or maybe it was Keith Collins, Jarman's partner, saying Derek was a bit like a bowerbird. You know, one of those things you get on David Attenborough programs, the bird that makes a garden to attract other birds. Keith Collins remembered Howard arrived at Prospect Cottage to photograph Derek in 1991. He was a keen plantsman. He gave up London weekends to chauffeur Derek via the nurseries of the south of England to Prospect Cottage. With his collaboration, the garden entered its second phase, the unexpected success of new plants and bulbs, flint and scallop shell edged beds, honeybees enclosed in a raised herb bed, and more seashore rusted metal and wind twisted wood. Sooley remembered that first visit to Dungeness as a magical day, the first of many that he would spend there walking, taking photographs and gardening. He later wrote, "Derek and I set out to the first of many walks along the beach up to the lighthouse. The photographs I took on that day are still among my favourites of him. I suppose they remind me of the start of a friendship, but also now help me to recollect what a strong and beautiful man Derek was before illness wasted his body." Howard Sooley often photographed Derek at Dungeness and in London between 1991 and 1994, with his evocative portraits appearing on the cover of all Jarman's books from then on. In Jarman's final journal, Smiling in Slow Motion, which he began writing in 1991 and continued writing until a few weeks before his death in 1994, there are many references, as would be expected, to the symptoms of his illness, notably the itching of his skin, which disrupted his sleep, so exhausting him that he writes, "At moments I wish my physical self would evaporate, cease, no more aches and pains. HB tells me to hold on." He also records in 1991 the first sign of the loss of sight that would affect him in 1993, writing, "I have felt a dizziness behind the eyes for a week, as if I was stoned. It's this that gives me a lack of concentration for reading and writing, and wondering if I will ever get another film made." In this final diary, Jarman unflinchingly catalogues his physical decline, cataloguing states of abjection in a clear-sighted and often humorous way. His diaries map out a landscape that was hidden from mainstream media of an identity unprivileged in what he calls heterosoc, whilst also paying frequent tribute to his carer and companion, Keith Collins. Jarman described his relationship with Keith Collins as the best relationship of my life. We've never argued, which seems amazing to me. Other people hammer each other, lay little mines. Perhaps it works so well because we're so different. There's the huge age gap to start off with. I'm an old colonel and he's a young sultan. And we're quite good at giving each other space. For instance, he goes back to Newcastle every 2 weeks for the weekend, and I go down to my house in Dungeness. It's platonic, sort of anyway, but whatever it is, it works. In January 1993, Jarman and Collins were interviewed for a newspaper feature called How We Met. Jarman again paid tribute to Collins, saying, I have to say, illness has bound the relationship together in an odd sort of way. You know, one's imminent dissolution at any moment. I don't know if that has altered the relationship, but it's certainly part of it. It would be silly not to acknowledge that. I'm a full-time occupation in one way or another. Jarman's impending death begins to punctuate his diary entries from 1991 onwards. He struggles to escape his sense of his own mortality, writing, I can never quite forget my illness. It gives finality to every gesture. He several times describes tidying up his house and his affairs in readiness for death, only to rally and recover once more. He queries, have I lived too long, past my sell-by date? He considers buying a new pair of shoes, but then decides that the pair that he's wearing will do to walk me out of this life. Remarkably, even despite his declining health, Derek Jarman did get another film made before his death. In fact, he made two. In 1992, Jarman completed the tragic comedy Wittgenstein, which reflected how queer politics and gay men's mental health had become his overwhelming preoccupation. He said the pressure put on you as a child made it very difficult to trust your emotions. As a young man, all I heard was pejorative words, faggot, queer, that sort of thing. You have to be very strong to counter that. In the final 18 months of Jarman's life, as he also continued to develop his garden at Dungeness with the help of his close circle of friends, notably Peter Fillingham, who realised the text work of Dunn's The Sun Rising, and with Carl Lydon, who helped create raised beds in the winter of 1992, where Jarman grew herbs and vegetables the following year. With Howard Sooley and other friends, Jarman continued to make forays to English flower nurseries like Rassel's in Earl's Court, Hellebore Heaven at Bodiam, and Madrona at Lydd in order to stock his garden at Dungeness, and he travelled to the cottage whenever possible to water and weed and tend his plants. Howard Sooley remembered that from 1991 onwards, I was to become a frequent visitor over the next few years, up and down the A2 or A21 from London, driving Derek to and fro. The back garden crept further in all directions as our plant treasures collected from the various nurseries along the way were given their chance to make a go of it in the shingle. I grew to love gardening there, the sea breeze cooling the heat of the sun, the foghorn sounding out of the mist. Those days in the garden at Prospect Cottage with time suspended or off elsewhere bothering someone else, were as rich as days can be. Digging in the shingle, scattering seeds, cutting back the Santalinas, breathing in the heavy scent of the sea kale, I can't think of a better use for my senses and soul. Although Jarman's declining health meant that he was frequently hospitalised and suffered from an array of unpleasant side effects, both from his disease and the drug regime being used to treat him, until his death he shuttled back and forth between Dungeness and the London art world of film screenings, exhibitions and dinners, and appointments at St Mary's and St Bartholomew's hospitals in London. Jarman's need for the tranquillity of Dungeness grew more pronounced as he became increasingly ill. But as his fame grew, his garden without walls became a site of pilgrimage for curious fans. In his last diary, he wrote, "Any strangers arriving upset me, more cars parked at the side of the road in my view, destroying my illusion of isolation. People wandering across the landscape are unaware of the poppy and seed kale seedlings. Could it be possible for people to arrive and improve the view?" In July 1993, Jarman's health became so compromised that he reluctantly signed a form declaring himself terminally ill, which meant that he received £70 a week in benefits. He noted ruefully, HB now pays all the bills. Howard Sooley says, I remember once picking up Derek from Bart's Hospital and driving down the A21 to Washfield Nursery en route to Prospect Cottage. He was quite ill at this point, and he told me how the doctors had explained he was becoming progressively blind and it would not be long before all his sight was lost. I was feeling deeply sad, but he smiled back at me and started to tell of his plans as a blind filmmaker. By the end of it, he was twitching with excitement. It was seemingly as much an opportunity as a disability. The film that Jarman dreamed up was his final major film, Blue, made in the last year of his life when he was aged 51, losing his sight and dying from AIDS-related complications. The film was inspired by the international Klein Blue colour trademarked by painter and performance artist Yves Klein, which Klein considered as having a quality close to pure space, associated with immaterial values beyond what can be seen or touched. In the film, Jarman presented the viewer with an unvarying blue screen that concentrated the viewer on the soundtrack, which detailed his declining physical state, in particular the loss of his sight. At a time when HIV sufferers were still mostly kept invisible, this constituted yet another extraordinary act of courage. The film was screened at the 1993 Edinburgh Film Festival, where it was rapturously received. Jarman explained, because there are no images, you can be as free as you like. The thing is, people are really so surprised they have so many resources because they come to it and they imagine all kinds of things that aren't seen on screen. So they're really surprised by themselves. Some of the most moving lines in Blue articulate Jarman's vision of his cottage in Dungeness as a transporting realm of comfort and pleasure. The sun comes out and floods this empty room. I call it my room. My room has welcomed many summers, embraced laughter and tears. Can it fill itself with your laughter? Each word a sunbeam, glancing in the light. This is the song of my room. Although Jarman mourned the loss of his friends' lives and his own life, in his final film he also gestured towards an eternal life that existed beyond the mortal realm, accessible through immersion in the spiritual colour of blue. He offered the thought that blue transcends the solemn geography of human limits. In the last months of Derek Jarman's life, Keith Collins wrote, slowly the garden acquired a new meaning. The plants struggling against biting winds and Death Valley sun merged with Derek's struggle with illness, then contrasted with it as the flowers blossomed while Derek faded. Howard Sooley wrote that as Jarman became critically ill, it became more difficult for him to visit his cottage. He recalled, we still took our walks though, usually around Smithfield's market. One day passing the chapel, Derek wanted to go in and look up hymns that might be sung at his funeral. We sat on a pew at the back in the growing gloom of late afternoon and opened a hymn book. I remember this one from school. Great tune, shame about the words, he said quietly. A few minutes later, I looked up to see tears rolling down his face. I put my arm around him and I could hear him reading the words of the hymn, open in front of him. All things bright and beautiful. Never has a hymn taken on such meaning to me. I understood in that moment the immensity of loss Derek was feeling, as he could see the night fall on the light and life of Dungeness. Derek Jarman died 2 weeks later in St Bartholomew's Hospital in London on the 19th of February 1994, aged just 52. He was buried in St Clement Churchyard in Old Romney, Kent. Today, Jarman's fenceless garden continues to bloom, now looked after by his friends and admirers, and is still the site of pilgrimage for visitors from all around the world. Derek Jarman came very close to outrunning the HIV virus, but tragically did not live long enough to see the development of drugs, which could have significantly prolonged his life. There's huge poignancy in realizing how close he came to living longer, as highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART, was licensed for use the year after he died in 1995. And by 1997, death rates due to AIDS plummeted in the Western world. Today, following increased frequency of testing for those at risk, use of immediate antiretroviral drug treatment for those who test positive, and the introduction of pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, it's been reported that the AIDS epidemic in Britain may soon be considered at an end. Derek Jarman also did not live to see the advent of the internet, digital photography, and film, or smartphones, innovations that he surely would have exploited to produce ever more free improvisatory film expressions. Although Jarman lived through times of repression and struggle against homophobia and HIV/AIDS awareness, he also did not live to see society become more tolerant, plural, and diverse. Jarman had been dead for 6 years when the age of consent for gay sex was finally lowered to 16. In the UK, the ban on gay people in the armed forces was also lifted in 2000 and was followed by legislation allowing gay couples to adopt children in 2002, the repeal of Section 28 in 2003, the legalization of civil partnerships for same-sex couples in 2005, and legislation to allow gay marriage in 2013. However, Derek Jarman, through his honesty, freedom from dogma, and acuity of vision, surely made an important contribution to the realization of these reforms through his work. Perhaps today, Jarman's vocal pleas for greater tolerance and understanding of diverse sexual identities have finally been heard. However, like the flowers he tended so patiently and hopefully in his garden against the salt spray, the wind, the gales, that legacy of thought needs to be cared for and kept alive. Thank you.
Hello again. Thank you, Sarah, so much for that. It's really, really nice. And sorry to interrupt you halfway through.
No, that's okay. I'm sorry if it was annoying with the paper.
No, it was really good, and really nice to hear it from the book that I haven't read. We said we'd open up the conversation to comments from the YouTube chat now, if anyone did have anything they wanted to pose to Sarah. Caboose wrote, do you think remoteness or a remove from everything is essential in providing an artist with perspective on the environment they are responding to, physically as well as mentally?
That's quite a compound question. It's a good one though. I mean, some of you will know already that I personally moved from Glasgow, which is quite a big city, in 2015 to live and work in Norfolk. I think that's, for me, was really instrumental, important move. And since I moved here, that's why I started getting interested in artists like Derek Jarman. And actually in the book that I wrote, I also wrote about Agnes Martin and Chris Burden as well, because they were also people who made this decision to kind of remove themselves a bit from the art world in order to concentrate, I think, on their work. So I think it can be very beneficial. But I think it's good to have both things. I mean, I think with all three of those artists that I mentioned, they lived somewhere remote, but they also dipped in and out of the art world. So Derek Jarman always went back to London again. Chris Burden always went back to LA again. Even like Agnes Martin had quite an active social life as well. So I think most humans need some social contact in order to thrive. I think you need both things, I think.
And yeah, interesting time to mention it with social contact at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And, that's one of the things that's kind of the bit where Derek Jarman's kind of saying that, he feels quite kind of claustrophobic that people keep coming to visit his cottage. I mean, I gather that today about 250,000 people a year go and visit his cottage. So, it's become more and more a site of pilgrimage, but I can imagine that felt a little bit intrusive when he was going there to try and rest and get away from other people. But of course, at the moment, we're probably all craving other people hugely and wishing that lots of cars would arrive outside our houses. So I don't think it's, at the moment, I think we're all probably missing that social contact that we usually have.
Kavisa said yes or no.
Yes or no answer, please. No, I can't say yes or no. It's got to be maybe.
Oh dear. And Melanie and Holly said, thanks, Sarah, absolutely fascinating, and can really relate to finding solace in the garden, especially during lockdown. Do we have any other questions or comments from anyone? Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight from a viewer. Oh, someone said, I'm a filmmaker and I'm currently working on a short film inspired by Jarman's work. Would you know any people or organisations that might support such a project?
Well, I'm not sure support in what way. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's been a lot more interest in his work over the last few years. So I know that the Garden Museum in London have, they've a new book exhibition there. There was an exhibition in Ireland as well, and obviously the Art Fund have had this successful campaign to secure the cottage for the future. So I think there'll be lots of organisations, I'm sure, that would be interested to know of your film. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I just saw that Caroline said something. Brilliant talk, thank you, Sarah. Have you been there, and what was your sense of the garden?
Yeah, so I went there when I was writing the book. So I went there in 2017, and it'd been like a kind of lifelong ambition to go there. I'm sure a lot of people, if they haven't been, they maybe have that thought that they would love to go to see this place. It definitely didn't disappoint. It was incredibly beautiful. And one thing that did kind of surprise me about it was that I'd read in the books about how this idea about that it's neither open nor closed because there's not fences around it. But at the same time, when I did go there, I did feel like an intruder. And so I did think that it could be a very positive thing that Art Fund might take over managing the cottage, because then you could about possibly standing on something you shouldn't stand on, or perhaps being a bit of an intruder. So, but the whole kind of area is really incredible where the cottage is. And the light there is very, very beautiful. I mean, as Jarman talks about, one of the things that I read, if you go to the beach there, the colours of the sea are really incredible. And there's a bird sanctuary that's nearby as well. So there's lots of reasons to go there. It's really fantastic, very, very interesting.
I don't know.
The films in the garden at Dungeness were so often dependent on a community and collaborations. Often putting a lot of trust in others when making the films. How do you think of this overarching vision and room for others in the work? I think it was like really generous. That's one thing that I thought about him, although sadly I never had the opportunity to meet him. But when you come across people who did meet him and did know him, and that's why I put in this image about the bowerbird, was that he was obviously somebody who loved others and wanted to bring other people in and to give them a chance. And I think a lot of the people that he worked with felt that he pushed them in a certain direction that made them more creative than they would have been otherwise. And I think that he perhaps had also had experienced that in a positive way from others. He talked about how Ken Russell gave him quite a kind of, generous rein when he was making those amazing sets designs for his films. So I think maybe when he had the opportunity to give other people opportunities, he did so. Yeah. What about the connection between remoteness and transcendence, which is not entirely physical?
That's just a yes or no answer as well.
Yeah, that's also a good question, a complex question, I think. I mean, I think I wanted to talk about his interest in poetry, because I think Henry and I were talking about this yesterday when we were doing the test, that Jarman's father made him do a proper degree before he went to art school. So he went to university, he studied architecture, he studied all kinds of different things. And I think that's part of the reason why he's got such a rich vision is because he knew so much about so many different things. And although I wasn't being entirely serious in quoting Robert Smith and saying that poets and essayists made the landscape, I like that kind of idea that he used the garden as a way of thinking through different kinds of time, different conceptions of time, and also different ideas of kind of embodiment. And it is moving when you go to the garden and you see plants there that he planted. Obviously, some of the plants, it was hard for them to survive, and he literally kept them alive by going up there, he and his friends, and watering them and putting manure on them. And they weren't plants that should have really thrived in that very kind of arid, hot environment. So the whole garden in itself is just a real testament to his spirit as a human, and also all of his friends and collaborators, that they made something materialize that was like so unique.
And it's nice also that it's at a time when we're all, everyone's been at home and is spending so much time looking at their own gardens.
Yes. Yeah.
Really caring for the spaces we do have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's the thing, is quite a lot of the things that he did were quite achievable. So obviously in Norfolk, I really like these kind of, he talks about these kind of hagstones with the holes in them, that he makes kind of sculptures with these. He makes quite a lot of sculptures with driftwood and things that he does find. And I think that that's something that everybody can kind of do for themselves. That's kind of fun and rewarding to, to pick up things and flotsam and jetsam and kind of value those things.
There's a few thank you messages. I don't know if these are people that you know, or
I think so. I think some of them are people I know, and some of them are people that I haven't met yet, friends I haven't met yet. So that's great. Thank you. Thank you all very much for tuning in. It's really nice.
Well, I'll say thanks again, Sarah, for doing the talk, and really interesting to hear. Some emojis from Caboose. I love the connection with time and time with film, which extends time while also stopping it.
Yeah.
Thanks. That was so beautiful and illuminating, like the garden. I was lucky enough to go in the late 90s. It feels like he was caring for himself through caring for the garden in challenging conditions.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that that was part of his interest in all those books, like Culpeper's books, that he grew medicinal plants. That was something he was really interested in. And actually, it's quite, I don't know if any of you have read the Maggie O'Farrell book, Hamlet, that she talks quite a lot about this kind of belief that was prevalent in Shakespeare's time about how you could use plants like rosemary, for example, or borage, as a way of kind of, caring for kind of illnesses and bringing health. And, obviously, as I say, I sort of feel it's like for me and for everybody really that kind of lost Derek Jarman, it's such a shame that the medicine wasn't developed faster to cure him. But I do think there was something about being in that garden and growing those plants that was very kind of comforting and meaningful for him, like, for sure.
Mm. And yeah, Nikki's saying thank you. Okay, I'm gonna round up now, if that's okay. Yeah. I'm just gonna say for oh, sorry. Nice to be reminded that community can enable beauty to flourish in challenging landscapes, political as well as geographical. From Jamie.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, this has been said before by lots of people that although Margaret Thatcher in many ways tried to put so many people down, she was also like, because she sort of provoked people into kind of action, she was sort of, unintentionally, there was some positive things came out of that era because people did draw together and mobilize. And that was so important. Absolutely. Yeah.
I was just going to do a quick announcement for the for the next event, which is in 2 weeks' time. Sorry, I had the YouTube video going at the same time, so it's confusing delay. The next event is on June the 25th, which on Thursday, June the 25th, in 2 weeks, which will be an international poetry reading, again, the same as 2 months ago, hosted by Kai Draper from Norwich. This one will have Isabel Baffy from London, Jonah Mixon-Webster from Flint in Michigan, Ellen Dillon from Limerick and Ireland, and Mira Matta from London. That's again on Thursday, June the 25th at 7:30. And if you like the event and you're interested in more, I'll post a link to the mailing list in the chat now for anyone who would like to sign up. There's a couple of last comments just coming in for tonight's event. I don't know if you're reading those too.
Dungeness is pronounced line with lunge and then Arness. That doesn't help me anymore. Sorry, I'm Scottish.
Dungeness.
Dungeness. Okay, sorry about that.
And Oliver Payne and Nicholas Rutherhold saying thank you, Sarah. Spent so much time at Dungeness over the years and seeing Derek's house so many times. It's been fascinating to learn so much more about him and his life this evening. Okay, well, I'll post the link to the main list in the chat. But thank you so much from us, and thank you to Sarah again, and good night.